Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Invisible Histories Project Talks, where we sit down and chit-chat with cool people doing amazing work in LGBTQ archives, history, and community organizing. I'm Megan Sullivan, she, her, hers, and I'm here with my colleague,
Josh Burford, he, him, his.
And we're going to, as always, let our guests introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So, Rachel, if you'll just tell us your name, your pronouns, where you are in the world, what you're doing, anything like that.
All right. Yeah, my name is Rachel Gehringer. I use they, them pronouns, and I am at my house in southeastern Kentucky, not county. I grew up in southeastern West Virginia, and I work on an oral history project called Country Queers, which I've been working on since 2013. Very self-taught, very DIY, but focusing on trying to meet and learn from and gather some stories from other rural and small town queer folks in the U.S.
Now, Rachel, remind me, because I feel like I got introduced to your work was it like 2015 when you were in North Carolina?
Yeah, so I started the project in 2013 and did a bunch of interviews that year and in 2014 while I was living at home in West Virginia and working in rural public schools, but trying to have sort of like a private online queer project because of trying not to be super out at work in the public schools. And I realized that wasn't working that well. So I went to grad school in Chapel Hill I did the master's program in folklore from 2015 to 2017. And I think we got connected through Barbara Lau, maybe?
Yeah.
The Polly Murray Project. When Queer History South was kind of just being imagined, I think.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That was the early stages of Queer History South, and we had no idea what we were doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we were just pulling in every person we knew who was in the South, had ever read a history book, and who might have been like adjacently queer.
That's a good place to start.
It was a big list, as it turns out. I think it was like 100 people on that list. Well, I've been super interested in your work for a couple of reasons. One, I am not an oral historian, and so it's one of the areas that I've felt a little like I could use more information about. But my first question for you is like, what is because you say you're self-taught, like what is the biggest like starting block problem when you want to get a project like this up off the ground?
Whew, so many, really. I'm in this funny position where I just did a Kickstarter, and I, for the first time in 7 years of the project, have a chunk of time to focus fully on country queers. And so I'm thinking back a lot and wishing I had done so many things differently. But I mean, I think that something that I love about oral history, and particularly like community-based, is that I do think it's a pretty accessible way of documenting communities, right? I think that if you're curious and you have questions and you're pretty good at listening and you have some kind of basic way to record something, you can kind of do it. Of course, there's a lot of like ethical and legal and more complicated things that you should do some research about. But part of what I really appreciate about oral history is that I do think there are some really great like community-based and sort of activist-based approaches to documenting communities that maybe haven't been traditionally documented. And so that was kind of the draw for me. In retrospect, like knowing what you plan to do with those. Are you trying to use them for a book? Then audio quality doesn't matter that much, which is what I thought I was doing. Now I'm making a podcast. I have a ton of really bad quality audio. So I think, having as clear of an idea as you can about what you plan to do with it is probably smart, and I wish I had done that better.
Well, before we get too further in, tell us a little bit about Country Queers. Like, what is it? How did you kind of come up with it, and how can people experience it?
Yeah, well, so I grew up, as I said, in southeastern West Virginia, about an hour outside of a town of around 3,000 people on a sheep farm. I rode the bus for 4 hours a day in high school. I grew up without TV, and it was, we got internet when I was in high school, maybe. So there wasn't, I'd never met an out queer person. I didn't really know that I was queer just because I'd never even seen queer media much until I left for college out of state in Western Massachusetts. And I think that I bought into this idea that I couldn't go home once I came out. And that was influenced a lot by like the queer media that was available, but also by sort of my peers who really, if not explicitly, like implied the sense that rural areas weren't safe for queer people. And because I hadn't like known any out people growing up, I spent 10 years away and was always just like super homesick. And when I did finally move home in 2011, of course, there are queer people where I grew up. There are queer people everywhere. I could see them and notice them differently. We could see each other in a way that wasn't true when I was 16. And I was excited about that. I also felt really isolated in some ways from queer community and just like needed to meet other people who were living like queer lives in rural places and small towns, both locally to me, but I was curious about how that was similar or different across like different geographies, different counties, different states, and also in terms of like the other layers of all of our identities beyond just our queerness. And so started interviewing people that I knew through a Central Appalachian youth network called the Stay Project in 2013, and did a Kickstarter in 2014 to take a month-long trip where I talked to 30 people in the South and Southwest. That was totally exhausting. I drove 7,000 miles and I just had a flip phone and it was a whole thing. I don't recommend that either to people trying to start an oral history project. But yeah, so since then it's kind of evolved, and there is a website. The website's currently being rebuilt where some of the stories in transcript form are, which is countryqueers.com. Through some grant funding, I was able to develop a gallery exhibit this past summer that's shown in 2 places, and then all the other showings are currently on hold due to COVID. And then, yeah, planning to launch a podcast this June. So just diving into some production on that.
That's a fairly ambitious project to start with. I mean, it totally makes sense to start with the people that you know. But how do you form those networks like outside of your initial state to be able to take a trip like that to the Southeast, and then where in the Southwest were you?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's just been luck. I do feel like I just have been sort of like fumbling my way through this with a lot of like dedication and also a lot of frustration that it's so hard to find these stories, which has changed a good bit since 2013, right? I think rural queer stories are much more accessible online now than they were at that point, when if you Googled sort of like rural and gay or anything, you know, the only easily accessible stories were sort of like Boys Don't Cry, Brokeback Mountain, Matthew Shepard, right? Which are all pretty tragic in terms of depictions of rural queer life. And so when I decided to try to take this road trip and do the Kickstarter in 2014, just the weirdness of the internet, it got shared around and boosted by a couple of different publications. And then I started to get contacted by folks kind of all over the country, even a couple people internationally who were excited about the project and excited to share their stories. So for the 2014 trip, which was the first time that I expanded beyond kind of my network, some folks had gotten in touch with me, quite a few actually. But I kind of planned out my route, and I reached out to like colleges and community colleges in smaller towns along the way, any kind of like statewide or local queer advocacy organizations that I could find, and just sort of tried to put the word out. And I also just, everybody that I know in any state, I said, I'm trying to do this thing. Do you know anybody? Do you know anybody who knows anybody? So that's kind of how I started. And then I think since then, as the project has gotten somewhat more well-known, it's gotten easier to find people. But I went in that trip in 2014 through Mississippi, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and then Kansas and Oklahoma.
That's a lot of states.
It was exhausting. It was amazing, but it's not, I don't recommend it. I mean, I do, but maybe if you have like more funding, better equipment, not just a flip phone. I don't know. Definitely killed that car after that trip. So
we started a community-based oral history project in Charlotte when I was there. I think it was right around 2015. And it was myself, and a trained oral historian from UNCC, Tina Wright, who's amazing. And then just community folks, like an intergenerational group of community people. And it was a lot of fun in some ways, but I think I did 3 oral histories and they were exhausting.
Yeah. That 2014 trip when I did, I was gone for a month and I did 30 interviews in that month. And I sort of described it to a friend when I was feeling particularly exhausted, that it was almost like I had an IV bringing in like stories and history. And I was so like, I just couldn't even barely talk afterwards, like I just absorbed all of these stories that were amazing and some really sweet and some really sad and, complicated in all the ways that our lives are. So yeah, I think, especially if you're trying to listen in a way where people can tell that you're really present with them, and you're trying to sort of read people that you probably don't know that well in terms of like, when have emotions gotten too intense and we should pause this because it's actually not something they want to share in this thing. When is it, just all the ways in which I think when you're sort of active listening, and my goal is that people feel as comfortable as they can sharing their story with me, because it can be so vulnerable. It can be super exhausting, I think, that kind of listening.
Yeah, and then you do actually have to care, because I know for me, not that I don't care about people, but somebody will be like, tell me this tragic story, and my brain will be gone, and then I'll be like, great, that was great. So blah 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 blah. They're like over there weeping tears because I'm just thinking about the laundry that I have to do. So like it is extremely exhausting.
I mean, none of my training in doing history work or doing archive work, and Megan and I talk about this a lot, prepared me for the emotional like burden it is to hear both. Like, it isn't just like, you're absolutely right, it isn't just sadness, it's also the joy. Because so few people get to tell you their stories, and you do have to be so present, and then you get pulled in, and then by the end of an hour you've heard something so personal that you feel like you've known the person for years.
It can be very like intimate, for lack of a better word, right? And this like really kind of intense, like accelerated bonding with someone who maybe was a total stranger.
Right.
And so to do that back to back to back to back is a lot. But it's also, I mean, I do feel like I'm just always so overwhelmed and so grateful that people like trust me enough to do that, because it's not, they don't have to. I think it's really a gift when people do. And so I take that really seriously, that like I have a responsibility to try to care for that story and present it in a way that's respectful, and be in touch with folks about how their story is used. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, you're right. There's something about hearing the words from someone's mouth. As an archivist, I love the distance that you get from a donor, in a sense, because it allows you to take your time to get to know them sort of slowly. Even in the donor moment where you're sitting in someone's living room and you're like looking at pictures, there's still kind of there's a pace to it. But with oral histories, it's like, just like deep into the pool. Like, this amazing thing happened and I've never told anyone, and you're like, oh crap, like,
right.
you told me, but like by extension, all the people that are going to listen to this story, which we're going to, and they're okay with it, and I'm like, ugh.
Yeah. Yeah. And then sometimes since 2014, I've mostly done interviews with people like a day trip or something. But on that trip, because I was traveling, I ended up staying with a lot of the folks. So they'd host me in their house. We'd eat meals together. They'd tour me around their property. And so that added a whole other layer to it, of just like this really fabulous rural queer tour.
I feel like of all the disciplines that we work in, you know, because Queer History South, the network, and then Invisible Histories, our project, we're kind of at that Venn diagram sweet spot between archives history and oral histories. And so it's always that sort of middle section. But I feel like oral histories of all the disciplines are the most resistant to academia. Like, you know, history feels very academic, and archiving, it feels like it's sort of bolstering up the historical work. But I mean, am I reading that wrong? But does it feel that way to you, that it does feel sort of like Wild West when you're out? Because anybody can get a phone and do an oral history if they want to. Like, you don't have to be professionally trained.
Well, right, which is me, right? So I would say that probably like an academically trained and based oral historian would maybe answer this very differently than me and be frustrated by my approach. But I love that about oral history, right? And in particular for like queer stories and queer history and histories of other marginalized communities, that because, you know, as people who work in history know, like it's such a power game. It's such a who is in history books, who isn't, throughout time, is so connected to issues of power and access. So that is something that I love about oral history, is that I do feel like people can do it. Clearly there's like a lot that you can do really wrong without spending some time trying to think about the issues of like ethics and getting consent, being really upfront with people about how their stories are going to be used. I wouldn't recommend that people just like go out with no plan, but I do think that it's wonderfully accessible in that way. I will say it's harder to figure out how to fund it because it's really long-term slow work if you're not based in academia, and it doesn't always easily fit for like grant funding in arts or in organizing, and if you're not in academia you can't really access that funding, so it's a bit tricky to do in some ways on your own. But
That's going to sound very familiar to Megan.
Yeah, we really sympathize with not fitting in traditional academics and then not also fitting in the arts. We're also in that weird little anything community organizing, and I think that goes a lot to the distrust of communities, which is, you know, so, I mean, it's fed by academics, of course, because you need someone professional to study this community, as if communities can't study themselves or don't know themselves better and
right.
can't, you know, do things in a not professional way, but in a valuable way. And so you talked about the increase of representation for rural folks, but you still see like the mainstream, the big funding happening in Atlanta and San Francisco and New York and the bigger cities. So how can these folks, you know, these academic people or people with the big money, how can they do better about, you know, outreaching to rural folks and including them and not just focusing on those metro areas?
Well, I feel this, I also sort of like cross into sort of media journalism spaces sometimes with this work, and I think that it goes for that in addition to sort of academic and funding spaces, is like I do think there's a lot of interest in rural stories, rural histories, rural queer stuff. But I think I often see people like assume that there aren't rural queer people in rural places already doing this work who need funding and who are probably already much farther along in terms of like having community connections, like, and you know, what you were just saying, that like there's a way in which people who are living and experience daily are experts in a way that someone who studies it from afar can't be, right? And so yes, I think like I would love it if just really anybody would like really look for rural queer people or rural people making media about their communities, doing history work about their own communities. And I think that goes for, again, like all sorts of marginalized communities, that I often think there's this assumption that like marginalized groups need to be documented or studied from the outside, as opposed to like, how can I support people who are members of these communities already doing this work? So that's one thing I would say. And to not kind of like recreate the wheel because you do have access to funding, but to think about how you can sort of like use your access to support people on the ground who are already doing the work. So that's not super specific, but that's my main thought on that question.
No, I think the takeaway from that is give folks money, pay them for their knowledge, their labor, their time. You know, we do see a lot of that with higher education and larger institutions, of them being really parasitic and, you know, using their resources in the wrong ways. And a lot of people, because of, you know, folks like you doing this kind of work, are starting to change that. And we have, you know, faculty folks who are really partnering with community people. But we have to see a bigger push for that, you know, from our grant folks and our big institutions, so that people get paid. Like right now is really highlighting the economic issues with this kind of work. Like folks need to get paid to do this kind of work and for their knowledges that they have. So thank you for letting me have that soapbox.
Yeah.
Well, so how do you said the project has changed a bit since you started in 2013. So what do you see being the trajectory of these stories? Like how are you imagining that they're used, and who is accessing them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think because I didn't know a whole lot about what I was doing and started just out of this like pretty intense personal need, and also like some sort of activist driven like frustration that our stories are so hard to find. My original vision was a book, right? And so it makes me laugh to say it now, but I was going to go to every state and do interviews and like put together a book, which now I'm like, that's so ambitious. It's so expensive. It takes so long. It'd be so overwhelming. And the publishing world is a whole thing of like, do people want an oral history book? You know, anyways. So that was the original vision. And I think after getting a ways into it, I was like, maybe the book isn't the best form, and maybe what is the most accessible way specifically for other rural queer people, which is the main audience for me, the primary audience, to find these. And I kind of, in grad school and a little bit after, I think spent some time just like wandering around in all the like possible directions it could go, and have sort of landed at, for now, making all the stories accessible on the website, as much as the person who shared their story is okay with it, because before I post anything, send the full transcript and let people know like this is it. They can make edits, they can take things out, and I have had people who, you know, by the time I'm ready to post it are like, it just feels not that relevant, I don't want it up there. So that's kind of my main guide, is the comfort of the person who shared their story. So yeah, what I'm trying to move towards actually this spring and summer, because I got this chunk of time to focus on it, is rebuilding the website, getting all of the stories that I have so far, which is like just over 60 up there. And then for some of them, producing sort of season 1 of a podcast, so that it's free, so that folks can access that kind of from wherever. I do still have like book dreams, but probably much smaller and more regionally specific to Central Appalachia, which is a place that I would feel more comfortable interjecting my own thoughts about, because, you know, I don't know a lot about what it's like to be queer in rural Mississippi, just because I've gone through there and talked to a couple people. So that's the plan. And I think that I'm not sure, like beyond this initial kind of collection, what the future of the project would be. Like maybe I'll get more funding and space and time and continue and go out and do more stories, and maybe I won't. Not sure.
I want to ask a question, but I don't know how to ask it exactly. Do you find when you're doing oral histories that people want to tell you a much sunnier, like brighter version of that story than they would if it were not being recorded? Because I feel like in the oral histories I've done, everything seemed like it was okay, even when it wasn't great. It was like, well, we were still fine and we were trucking along. I'm like, okay, but nobody was fighting. Like nobody said something real stupid. Do you find that funny?
That's an interesting question. I think some people for sure, like, you know, you're telling a stranger about your life, you're probably not going to be like, here's my deepest, darkest, lowest moment in great detail and anguish. But I also think, you know, I think some of it depends on the person, because I also have gotten some of those stories, and some just like really intense and not sugar-coated stories about you know, being a queer kid who came out and got kicked out of the house, chased out of the house with a baseball bat and was homeless for months. You know, like I think there's also people who have shared really not everything was fine stories, although maybe now in retrospect, that's the angle they took. But yeah.
It's an archival problem too, because you get, you know, what you're collecting are what people have determined should be kept. And there's very little of the problem and so much of the process. And it'll skew. There was a collection that we got in Charlotte that basically this organization had to fire its executive director, and we were trying to do the oral history for the last surviving member of that original group. And I was looking through the material and I'm like, I don't see anything about that in your material. Like, where is all that? We found a folder of all the tea, like the full dirty tea, because someone had taken it, put it in a folder, and then slid it under someone's door and said, like, hold on to this. And so,
Whoa.
I don't know. I think a lot about, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I feel like predominantly straight audiences are expecting us to be tortured in our story because that's what they've seen of us. Right, like you said, like, you know, we've all been chased around the house with a baseball bat. But then I feel like the opposite of that is true, that when we as queer people are retelling our stories, we want them to seem so familiar that they kind of get whitewashed. And so I feel like that's one of the things that I struggle with when I'm collecting. And I wondered if that was something that you had considered for oral histories too.
That's interesting. I haven't really thought about that much, but I think that one thing is, when I first started doing interviews in 2013, you know, I came up with a list that was just like, here's things I would want to know. And I shared it with some other friends who were also country queers and was like, what would you want to know? And people added in some different questions. But a real good friend of mine who's a total sweetheart, who I've interviewed twice actually, because I love him so much, whose name is Sam Gleaves. He's also a really great traditional and country musician, writes a lot of like gay country songs, worth looking up. But he said something to me in 2013. He was among that first group of people I did interviews with. And he was like, I want to know about people's like joy, you know, because I think a lot of my questions were like, what's the hardest thing about being a rural queer person? And what's the biggest struggle facing your community? And what's, you know, my list was maybe heavy on the challenges side. And Sam was like, what's the funniest thing that's ever happened to you around these intersections of identities? What's the most, like, what brings you the most joy? And so I've tried to build in questions that ask across kind of experiences like that. And I'd say, you know, it'll be interesting now that I get a chance to kind of dive back into these transcripts, which I haven't been super closely involved with in a couple of years, to think about what you just said.
I don't know, just something that scratches the back of my head.
Yeah.
Well, the group that we had and I'll give a shout out to the Charlotte LGBTQ Oral History Project. They, you know, it was exactly what you said. Like, we were all so frustrated that we knew all these amazing stories. We didn't have them anywhere. And we were like, to hell with it. We'll just buy a Zoom recorder and start interviewing. And so we had the foresight, I guess, to like lean into our local resources and bring in an oral historian who had been trained, who sat us in a room together and said, ask these 5 questions and interview this person you already know. And we're like, that's easy. And then by the end of it, everybody was crying, naughty, and like, oh my God, I can't believe I just told you that. And it was like, okay, so we have definitely bit off more than we can chew with this story. But as soon as we got past that initial like fright of it, people around the world, they're like, I know this 90-year-old lesbian who lives in the mountains in Nashville, and I'm going tomorrow. And they're like, in the car. And I'm like, do it. Like,
yes.
Get it handled.
Yes. Especially the 90-year-olds. I've been having, you know, I haven't gotten to interview as many like elders as I wish. And I've just been thinking about that a lot the past year probably, but I think especially right now with the virus, it's just been on my mind so much. Like, yeah. And I think particularly like in rural places, we don't have a lot of like older folks stories, you know?
Yeah.
Well, and then too, you know, right now a lot of folks are home or isolated. You can record your own story. You don't necessarily have to have, it is easier, I think, to jog your memory and to engage with someone. But, you know, if you have things you want to contribute, record your own story. Just sit down, even if you do it in little spurts here and there. And then there are people like IHP and Country Queers that would love to get that story. So for, folks who are watching that aren't getting reached out to, because you can't hit everybody, you can absolutely do your own oral histories. You don't need someone else to ask you the questions.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, are there any other things that we should talk about? Any other comments or things you would like to talk about before we go?
I don't think so. I'm just glad that you all exist too and are doing the work you're doing. And I'm really excited for the Queer History South whenever it happens, the rescheduled.
Yes. 2022, springtime. Yes, fingers crossed that it will.
Yes.
We'll be hopefully releasing the date in the next couple months when we have a better idea. But where can we find your stuff? What's your website, Instagram, that sort of thing?
Yep. So it's just Country Queers at all the places. So countryqueers.com, Country Queers on Instagram, Country Queers on Twitter.
Yeah,
on Facebook.
That feels smart for branding.
Why didn't we think of that?
Listen, Invisible Histories is apparently popular. I don't know. So there you go. All right. Well, thank you so very much. And we'll catch all of y'all later.
Thank you.
Bye.